Hi everybody, it's March 16th, 2026, and I've been posting these videos as my recovery from the trauma of watching my little brother, 64 with Down syndrome, be locked up by the British Columbia New Democratic Party government for 588 days before he died at Burnaby Hospital, or I believe he was killed. He was sedated to death. So they locked Paul away. I was his last surviving visitor. They locked him up after I complained to the Burnaby police about what I believe to be a secret, fraudulent, and forged power of attorney they created to give him the COVID-19 shot on February 1st of 2021. I didn't find out for a year. And so they locked him up, and I did everything on earth I could think of to try and restore our visits and his freedom. And then after he died on April 23rd of 2024, the person the government appointed as his guardian, my 84-year-old Catholic nun sister, 4,000 kilometers away in Ontario, who had never lived with him. She moved out, entered the convent when he was born, didn't understand his speech or his communication. She had two law firms working for her around the clock. I believe the Catholic Church spent about $2 million on her legal representation, and she had me declared a vexatious litigant. So that's a very rare and unusual designation, which takes away the normal civil rights that any human being in Canada has to litigate. I worked as a lawyer for about 23 years, and then I became disabled in an accident. But I've been declared a vexatious litigant. So that's why I started posting these videos. And Paul died almost 2 years ago, and I believe what my sister was hoping to do was forestall a wrongful death. I believe that she ordered he had a stroke, and he was recovering very remarkably from a stroke. But when she found out that the Burnaby police were going to proceed with an investigation into this fraudulent and forged power of attorney, she ordered the care staff, the doctor, Michael Baker, to sedate Paul to death. He was dead within 2 hours of her finding out I'd been contacted by the police. So, as I'm recovering from the trauma of watching my little brother be killed right in front of me, my last surviving sibling in Greater Vancouver, I'm starting to notice other things. And before this all happened, I had been posting. I just started to discover the impact of euthanasia in Canada. The Supreme Court of Canada reversed itself. You never voted for a government that promoted euthanasia, or there was never a referendum that the government could start killing extrajudicially Canadians, which it's by July of 2026, Canada will have killed extrajudicially mostly by lethal injection, 100,000 Canadians, mostly poor, white, Canadian-born women like me. They don't have to be dying. They don't have to be near death. Everything that you thought, all the protections that you thought were in place aren't in place. It's been a riot of killing in Canada. So I just wanted to talk about it because this war in Iran has stressed me out. I'm a child of the Vietnam War. I just realized I was born 2 weeks after the Vietnam War started in 1955. And I got married 2 months before it ended in 1975. So I was so stressed out by this, what Donald Trump is now calling an excursion into Iran because he knows that Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution prohibits him from conducting war. Wars have to be approved by wars, kidnappings, and I think murders have to be approved by Congress, and that hasn't happened. But I just wanted to notice. I just noticed, and I just wanted to point out the similarities between. I've been following this Nancy Guthrie case, 84-year-old woman that was abducted from her home in the dark of night on February 1st of this year. Now, she is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, who was the top person working at the Today Show for NBC. And Savannah Guthrie is worth about $40 million, and she makes about $8 million a year. And she has a brother and a sister. Her brother is a retired Air Force pilot. And her sister is, I guess the best way to describe her is a jeweler, a jewelry maker, and a failed poet, a black poet. She writes about very dark subjects. And her sister, Annie, is married to a man named Tommaso Cioni, who is a part-time grade 6 charter school teacher. So Annie and Tommaso live about 4 miles from where Nancy Guthrie lived in Tucson, Arizona, in the hills behind Tucson, Arizona. And I imagine that Annie and Tommaso were the primary caregivers for Nancy Guthrie. Nancy Guthrie had serious health issues like me. She had a heart condition. She had a pacemaker. She was on blood thinners. And she had just been prescribed very strong hearing aids. So she was 84, living by herself in a huge house that she'd lived in for 41 years in the hills, the Catalina Hills behind Tucson, Arizona. So the family, Tommaso and Annie, were contacted the morning of February 1st of 2026 by a small group of church people that would watch church proceedings online on Sunday morning. And when Nancy Guthrie didn't show up, they contacted Annie and Tommaso, and Annie and Tommaso went over to Nancy's house and discovered a bloody doorstep and blood around the house and other things that alarmed them. So they called the Pima County Sheriff Department. And the sheriff, the politician who was elected sheriff of, it's an elected position, his name is Chris Nanos. And I just thought of the similarities of Chris Nanos to Donald Trump. And it's kind of like a parallel of watching this investigation into the abduction of Nancy Guthrie, which is really, it's only on a scale of the Lindbergh kidnapping of little Charles Lindbergh, which was almost 100 years, or more than 100 years ago. But it's very similar to the Donald Trump's excursion into Iraq, in that Donald Trump has provided completely conflicting mixed messages, has reversed himself on numerous occasions about they're winning, they're not winning, they're doing well, they're not doing well. And Sheriff Nanos has reversed himself innumerable times. He won't let a professional or especially appointed public information officer speak for him. He always likes to be front and center. and he just made innumerable gaffes. But I just couldn't help but see the parallels. It's like I'm watching a shadow war or representation of the war or the excursion into Iran. But my opinion about what's going on is that the family, you always start in any... I was a federal prosecutor and a family lawyer for 23 years, and you always start in an investigation with the people closest. 80% of the time, if you're murdered, you'll be murdered by someone you know or someone that's close to you. So the people closest to Nancy Guthrie were her daughter, Annie Guthrie, and her daughter's husband, Tommaso Cioni. And notwithstanding that, Annie Guthrie and Tommaso Cioni have never come out and independently been interviewed by the press or by a reputable journalist. And actually, Savannah Guthrie hasn't either. Savannah Guthrie made about 6 online videos of pleading for information about her mother and to have her mother returned. And I couldn't help but notice that Annie Guthrie was in 2 of these videos that were made to plead for the return of Nancy Guthrie. And during these videos, Annie Guthrie never looked at the camera. She never looked at the camera lens. She mumbled. She didn't use it as an opportunity to plead for her mother worldwide. And then when they visited the Flower Memorial outside of Nancy Guthrie's home in Tucson on March 2nd of 2026, Annie Guthrie kept her back to the reporters that were standing there, the journalists and reporters that were watching. And she never said anything. She didn't plead for the return of her mother or for any information about her mother's whereabouts. And she howled very overdramatically, like wailed as she was looking at these notes and flowers from people who had dropped by. And, well, as I said, I just found it very odd that usually there's a literature and research done on how innocent family members of missing persons act, and generally they are shameless in pleading with the public for the return of their loved one. They speak to their loved one, they plead with the public, they don't mind being asked questions, they accept that being investigated as possible perpetrators is part of dealing with the abduction of a loved one, or the fact that a loved one is missing. But Annie Guthrie, and certainly Tommaso Cioni, has never been interviewed. I mean, even Scott Peterson allowed himself to be interviewed by Diane Sawyer when Lacey Peterson went missing. And interestingly, during that interview, Scott Peterson's telephone went off, but he didn't even look at it, even though Lacey Peterson was still missing. And what everyone took from that is that he knew where she was. And as it turns out, he did know where she was, as he had murdered her. So apparently now, Savannah, very wealthy, Savannah Guthrie has a New York City, Manhattan townhouse worth $11.5 million and a huge estate in upstate New York. I mean, she's fabulously wealthy. And she's come out recently threatening to sue anybody that alleges or that asks for more of an investigation or answers from Annie Guthrie and Tommaso Cioni, which, considering that Savannah Guthrie didn't even ensure that her mother was in a safe home. The subscription on the Nest camera that was supposedly protecting the house had lapsed. So there was no subscription, there was no recordings of the people that had abducted Nancy Guthrie. So, and considering that she wore strong hearing aids, she was really not a person that should have been living all by herself. Her dog had just died. So I was offended by the fact that Savannah Guthrie, the wealthy daughter, who has all the power in the world, has threatened anyone who points fingers at Tommaso Sioni and Annie Guthrie. And there's a saying in Latin, cui bono, who benefits, when you're trying to assess who might have committed a crime, and who Tommaso Sioni and Annie Guthrie are they just bought a new house, but they're not wealthy. And Nancy Guthrie was in a huge, very nice house, and it was looking, I think with her health issues, it was going to be the case that very soon she'd have to go into a nursing home, and with all the expense that would entail. So the parties that stood to benefit the most were Tommaso Sioni and Annie, the failed poet Guthrie. So I just couldn't help but see the parallel between this Sheriff Nanos, bumbling Sheriff Nanos in Pima County in Arizona, and Donald Trump dealing with Iran. But I've chosen to focus on the Nancy Guthrie abduction rather than the Iran war, because I just can't handle one more war. I was born 2 weeks after the Vietnam War started in November of 1955, and I got married at 20, 2 months before the Vietnam War ended in 1975. So Americans engaging in wars is something that causes me concern. Oh, there was just one other item in the news that I wanted to point out, is that Mark Carney met with King Charles III in London today, and he affected a fake British accent, which everyone pointed out. And I just thought, do you have the accents down pat for the other 31 countries that you had citizenships for? Because he had 3 passports. He had a European Union passport because he had an Irish passport. He had a UK passport and a Canadian passport. And when people raised an uproar about this before the last election on April 28th of 2025, he supposedly dropped the UK and European Union passport. But that gives him that he had 32 citizenships at the time. People started to complain. And I've checked online, and apparently he can reinstate those citizenships with just a simple declaration. So it won't be a problem for him to restore all his other, he obviously wants to cover all his bets. But I said in my posts about him visiting with King Charles III, after this, bribing 4 members of Parliament now to cross the floor to the Liberals, thwarting the wishes of us voters. And as I've repeatedly pointed out, Canada has killed extrajudicially 100,000, or will have killed by July, more than 100,000 innocent, vulnerable Canadians as so-called medical assistants. And as I've repeatedly pointed out, medical is from the Greek, then Latin word or verb to heal. And you don't heal anybody by killing them. And there's been a prohibition against killing our elderly and disabled and ill members of our society for 40,000 years. The Neanderthals didn't do it. We have Neanderthal skulls that were healed over. because somebody cared for them and they were not killed or left to fend for themselves. So I said I hoped that King Charles III, who, by the way, is in a country that put in place the Magna Carta to limit the unfettered actions of the king on June 15th, 1208. And now we have a prime minister in Canada. He's not my prime minister, but a prime minister in Canada has presided over the extrajudicial killing of more than 100,000 Canadian citizens, mostly Canadian-born, elderly people like me, women, females. That's the standard person that they've been killing with a lethal injection, using off-brand poisons, injections of off-brand poisons. So that's it for today. Those are all. Thanks so much for listening to me. I woke up this morning thinking, God, I thought I was going to leave the world in a better state than I found it. And here I'm in a country where the government kills the most vulnerable people at the rate of 16,000 a year, or 45 people a day are killed by a medical doctor or nurse administering a lethal injection extrajudicially with no legal or judicial oversight whatsoever. And 100,000 deaths, not one person has been charged criminally for murder. And you can bet your bottom dollar that it wasn't done properly every step of the way. So that's it for today. I love you all. Take care.